Welcome to Happy Times and Places, a positively inclined Doctor Who episode commentary podcast in which I, Toby Haydock, comment along to an episode accentuating the positive and see if I can try to guess what my special guest's favourite things about each instalment are.
Hello, my name is Jeremy Bentham. I'm very pleased to nominate as my Doctor Who story for Toby's enterprise, Marco Polo.
And so we've done it. We've reached the end of our journey to Cathay, which is what this story is called in a lot of the paperwork, but I'm still going to call it Marco Polo. I'm actually less bothered about that than I am having trawled through the paperwork, than I am about calling the Edge of Destruction, which, having just done that for Too Much Information, which is one of the related podcasts to this, I found myself calling Inside the Spaceship, but I don't like that as a title, and it's relatively new to me. I say relatively new, about 20 years. And I also refuse to change my mind. Even though when it was first mooted, we call Inside the Spaceship, I was like, definitely not. That's just silly. And now I kind of think, well, actually, and especially as The Edge of Destruction is just the title of episode 1, and we ignore the Radio Times 10th anniversary special when it calls lots of other stories by the first episode title, so the Romans is the slave traders or whatever, and we go, well, that's just really poor. We don't do that except for The Edge of Destruction when we do. And the Daleks, well, obviously it's easier to call that the Daleks than the Mutants because there's a story called The Mutants. There were no other stories with the Daleks in. No. But yeah, Journey to Cathay, but it's Marco Polo. It's Marco Polo. But anyway, it's episode titling, whatever theory you have, it's a theory with a hole. So Marco Polo, let's. Well, we can certainly agree that as a story, it's mint. Let's press play on the final episode of this epic tale that we are taking alongside one of the founders of Doctor Who fandom and one of its greatest historians, Jeremy Bentham. We're going to see what happens when there's an assassin at Peking in 3, 2, 1. So I put this off. I've been supposed to do this a couple of times. Jeremy very kindly was very quick to record his contribution, although with unnecessary apologies about the filming of it, and I had a couple of goes, and bless him, he's actually filmed it in lots of different locations around his house, apposite to what he is choosing as his favourite thing. Now, I don't know if they're in this, because no word of a lie, I've unlike a lot of Happy Times and Places, I have done these episodes as a viewer in recent weeks, in order that I'm not coming in totally blind, and because there's no subtitles on recons to aid me with following as I talk at the same time. And I mention that because there's a couple of off-screen stills of these later episodes that were taken by a viewer in Australia, which were all we had before we got the telesnaps in terms of the broadcast program, but I'm not sure they've made their way into this recon. They may have done. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if they're available to the reconstructors. It's lovely seeing the TARDIS in a forest clearing. And here is Ling Tao, Paul Carson, who I've looked up what I know in my little database. But they've killed poor old Kuitju because he's no longer useful to plot, and you can see there's a knife in his back there, but that would have been cut by the Australian censors. So Kuitju gets killed. I've got a feeling Tigana kills him in the book, but I might be wrong. But anyway, he dies because, I was going to say, he's no longer useful to the plot. He would be useful to sort of dob in Tigana, which he would. I'm sure he would have, the craven soul that he was, I'm sure he would have caved in during interrogation. But he's been killed by an overzealous extra guard. It always leaves a slightly nasty taste in the mouth there, where some, unknown, non-speaking character with very little agency, all he does is just rather thoughtlessly and callously butchers someone. Beautiful shot there in that telesnap of various supporting artists through one of the decorative sort of walls with bits missing. I don't know what they're called. I'm sure there's a name. But you know what I mean. It's a wall with holes in it because it's a partition, some form of decorative partition. But anyway, I've noticed a few bits of shooting through various glorious bits of the set. This is maybe where Clive Doig's "and the camera crashes into a pillar" comes into play. And the Doctor with his glasses. I always like it when the Doctor wears glasses. I don't know why. I'm not a glasses wearer myself. I found myself having to look at stock cube boxes. I've sort of take them slightly further away in order to read what it says on the box. I do that thing where you slightly adjust, which I never had to do. But I went for an eye test and they said my vision was fine. It's just that comes with age. So it's not that I identify. It's not that I need for me to be able to identify with the central character, for the Doctor to be a glasses wearer. I just like it. And as an actor, a pair of spectacles always gives you. I'm never one to resist a prop. And I noticed there's a small person as Kubla Khan's sort of factotum, which is again very progressive to have that sort of representation on screen, especially as the character doesn't actually, is just there to be sort of present. Because again, there's not enough representation. It's getting better these days, but I know from my partner's work with the Disabled Artists Networking community that small actors, do struggle for work and representation and all sorts of other stigma. And anyway, we don't need to get into another, but I know a couple of comics who would absolutely berate anybody rightly for anything sexist or racist or homophobic or transphobic, that aren't afraid to do jokes about and using a word beginning with M that I would not use to describe a small person, and seem to think that's okay somehow. It's interesting where people draw different lines. But I love a couple of elements of this. I love the fact that the Doctor beats the Khan, because the Doctor can sometimes be doddery, and a bit of a klutz. He's klutzed his way into the Khan's affections by having a bad back. He's sort of a bit klutzy in the gunfighters, and sometimes in historical situations, the First Doctor sort of almost accidentally prospers. Whereas here, he's very wily. He's good at the backgammon, but that then pays off later. But I like the fact that he's trouncing the Khan. I sometimes don't like it when the Doctor's over good at things. I did take, I was never quite sure about Matt Smith's Doctor, who's so brilliantly alien in The Lodger, suddenly being good at football, because I, as the kid that wasn't good at football at school, liked the Doctor to be not good at the things that people were traditionally good at. But the alpha males at school weren't exactly busting out the backgammon, so I think it's fine for the Doctor to be good at backgammon and to be winning so comprehensively, which makes you think, oh well, we're going to tidy up this part of the plot. He's going to win the TARDIS back. And of course, then the wonderful twist to that is that he doesn't. Then he has another really weird laughing fit like he does at the end of episode 1, which is again a sort of an element of the Doctor's characterization that we never really visit again. The Doctor laughing like a loon in the face of utter disaster. Maybe there's something in his Chinese tea, I don't know. And I like Marco's role in this. Marco really properly is the hero of episode 7. Actually, he learns and he does the right thing in the end, and is not punished for it. And he actually gets. The implication is that he kind of gets what he deserves, having learnt. And he never really did. He never knowingly did the wrong thing, apart from nicking the TARDIS. No, that's pretty bad. But in his eyes, his need is greater, and he doesn't think. he's consigning the others to disaster, and as he said to Ian, a couple of last episode, if I believed you about the time machine thing, of course I'd give you the key. This is an effective set. This, again, I wonder how it would look in the studio, but the perspective seems to be very nice. It seems open and airy compared to some of the interior stuff, and a lot of that's down to the lighting, of course. But we really feel like they're an ensemble, don't we? We feel like we've the TARDIS crew are part of Marco Polo's caravan, essentially. These people, I've never seen that photo before. Look at those costumes. They are amazing. And yeah, we didn't have, I didn't think we had any photos of Ling Tao until we got the telesnaps. So I'm wrong there. There's so many more photos of Marco Polo than I thought we had, and I thought we had a fair few. So seeing some of these, I'm seeing some beautiful shots that are new to me. But yes, Paul Carson. I emailed not his widow because they were divorced. I've emailed the lady that he was married to when he did Marco Polo, and I've looked up what I know about Paul Carson, who plays Ling Tao, who, as I mentioned a couple of episodes ago, is one of the actors whose history is unclear and who the internet certainly get wrong because he's not also a Canadian sports anchor. Here's that lovely twist. We think that really nagging, slightly annoying part of the story, in a good way, that our heroes... look at that shot of Marco and Ian with Ping Cho in the background as they argue about her. That's a great piece of composition. And that's from a telesnap, so it would have been embarrassing had that been some reconstructor's wizardry, some loose cannon, beautiful tapestry, but it's not. It's definitely from off-screen. And we know that Boris Hussein knows where to put a camera. He knows how to move a camera as well. That's what we lose, his wonderful sort of creeping camera that he employs sometimes to suggest menace and atmosphere. Although this story requires different things, but yeah, he knows how to move a camera. But yes, I love that part of the story, the TARDIS, where you think it's got wrapped up because the Doctor's got himself into a situation where he's won beautifully, the entire produce of Burma for 1 year. What a line. What a wonderful thing to win. And then we have the resolution. But that we think that story is going to get wrapped up. No, in the crucial game, he loses. So the TARDIS, he has lost the TARDIS still, even though the atmosphere in terms of the danger to the regulars is not what it has been earlier. That's good. That's developed. They're welcome at court. The Doctor is getting on with Kubla Khan. They've really made some progress in their interactions with Marco, but the Khan doesn't want to give the Doctor his TARDIS back, and that's completely understandable. And again, gorgeously, he's not doing it because he's being mean or despotic. Is that he's been given a brilliant present, and he's won it legitimately in a game of backgammon. He does a lot of. He's like a Cheshire cat. Is Tigana wily, and then we have. There's a couple of things I haven't mentioned. The wonderful fact that the Empress to Kubla Khan is Claire Davenport, who you would probably know best for the Fawlty Towers episode, where he does the fire alarm, and Sybil is and she's a pleasantly complaining customer. Voluminous is how Jeremy Bentham described her. She's a larger lady, which again is a wonderful contrast to the slight diminutive figure of Martin Miller, and that's a lovely piece of casting, and it's a lovely dynamic that the Khan has this rather bossy wife. I think that's rather fun. But then we have the resolution, don't we, of the Ping Cho story, where she's been dragged to marry this guy, which we look at and go, well, that's not very nice for a young woman to be forced into a union that she doesn't want with a senior gentleman that she's never met. Although another side of that is to go, who are we to impose our cultural expectations on another culture who do things that way? If you want to be like that. but I think I certainly fall on, it just shows that sometimes these things are very difficult, because the thing that is more empowering for women in our Western view is that they, well, no, I think it's pretty much, well, is it though? It's difficult, isn't it? Because that's us imposing our values, isn't it? But I think it's a value of some merit that people should be able to choose who they marry. But in even saying that, I could be very, very much favouring what I grew up with, and patronising another culture because of my. So it could all be a bit of a minefield, which is why I think people should be allowed to muse on stuff without being accused of some sort of beastliness. Anyway, maybe I just imagine all that because I spend too much time on Twitter. But anyway, there's a shot through a chair, or is it through no? That might be through a holy as in full of holes, a Swiss cheese partition. So Marco's had his own moment. Oh yes, and here we are, that Ping Cho's husband to be. So they've cut. It's very nice and budget saving that we don't see the big dinner, but they come out of the dinner in order to hear the glorious news for Ping Cho, who we're sort of happy for. I mean, it's a bit hard if you're the guy that she was going to marry, but he has drunk a potion. What is it? He's drunk a potion of quicksilver and something else to basically mean that on his wedding day he has enough vigor coursing through him in order to rise to the occasion, which is all pretty grim if you think about it. He overdoses on that and dies. So it's a comedy death off screen. Lack of noise is off for the husband to be. So he becomes a sort of rather amusing victim of the lack of knowledge about, because Quicksilver's. Yeah. Anyway, about for whatever. It's a comedy moment. He drinks a potion to invigorate him, and it topples him off his perch, and so that gets Ping Cho out of the situation. And there's a shot of her here with Ling Tao, and I don't know if that's a composite. And she says, "I would like to stay here." Now, does she give Ling Tao a look? There is the suggestion that she's gonna hook up with Ling Tao, or I think that happens in the book maybe, but he's the one that kills Tigana in the book. The young officer. Yes, he escorts her to the quarters, but do we get a bit of a suggestion that they might have an eye for each other, or have I imposed that upon them? It would be interesting to see if they do a bit of, I quite like the look of you acting. And yes, the young officer, Ling Tao, who I started talking about several moons ago, Paul Carson, who I'm sure Warris Hustain told me had done some model work for some cigarettes. I have contacted the lady to whom he was married at the time, and what I know about him was that he was an American born in Texas. So yes, he's doing RP in this. Of course he is, as actors tended to have to do. Although Martin Miller's not. Martin Miller, again, it's a really bizarre thing, isn't it? But a bit like you see certain actors popping in, often with anglicised names. Because again, that was kind of how things were done, which you would hope that people didn't have to do now. But people, anglicised their names. But I mean, God, a lot of Jewish actors did that in Hollywood, didn't they? All sorts of people whose names become more sort of, well, anglicised is wrong because I'm talking about America, but you know what I mean, westernised, whatever. So why was I talking about that? Yes, because Martin Miller is speaking in a, he never lost his Czechoslovakian accent, and the same with people like George Pravda, so you have a Castellan who's Czechoslovakian, which is interesting. We sort of go, well, but why aren't the different countries on Gallifrey? There are different accents and countries on Earth, so why aren't there on any other planet? But it seems slightly odd to us, in the same way that it seems odd if somebody has a northern accent, people still comment on it, which shows that in many ways, a lot of our embedded little prejudices still need a lot of work. I think there are more regional accents on telly in the past 20 years But, it used to be that all actors, wherever you were from, when you went to drama school, certainly at this time, you would your natural accent would become RP, and a lot of actors I know from that generation who were born talking with a particular dialect now speak in RP because that's what they learnt to do at drama school. Oh, and talking of changing names, I mean, it wasn't just actors of foreign extraction, and in fact, some kept their names in order to sort of advertise, I'm available for those sorts of parts. So, there were decisions to be made. But Mark Eden's real name was Douglas Malin. But Mark Eden was seen as as two single syllable things is easier off the tongue, So there's all sorts of things that actors considered in those days, and probably less so now. I don't know any actors who changed their names for reasons of that name sounds cool in a way that actors did then. Fewer actors, I think, change their names now. Some have to do because of equity rules, but it's more fashionable, I think, to add your middle name. So if there was another Toby Haydock now, they would call themselves, Toby Orinoco Haydock to differentiate themselves from the other Toby Haydock. Fortunately, I'm in a position where nobody's been bestowed a name as stupid as mine, so I've not had that issue. But Paul Carson was born in America. So he was an American actor who had obviously learned his RP over here, who worked over here. And I believe he died in 1989 back in the States, having done various bits of telly in the 60s. He's in a once lost Dennis Potter play called Emergency Ward 9 in the late 60s. But what he did between the 60s and his death in 89, I do not know. But maybe his former wife will be able to tell me. Maybe she won't reply. But I've bunged it out there to see what happens. I've got a feeling that my CD of this, I remember getting it. Oh God, I used to go up to Forbidden Planet in Manchester on the off chance that the audiobook of this had come out, because in those days you never got sort of exact dates or knew where everything exactly was. It was the early days of getting stuff at the touch of a button. In fact, I don't think you can. I think it was before Amazon. Yeah, because I remember when I first tried to buy stuff off Amazon, I wasn't in the house that I was in when I listened to this. So yeah, I had to make journeys, especially into town, on the off chance that Marco Polo was there. And it wasn't. And when I finally got it, I think that bit where Marco and Ian meet in the corridor, it started to slightly jump. So even when I had it, I never quite listened to the whole thing. Oh, and the Vizier, who was a sort of comic character telling everyone to kowtow, jumps in front of Kubla Khan to save him. And the Vizier is Peter Lawrence, one of those actors that I sort of thought had long stopped acting by the time I was looking around for actors, because you didn't see a lot of those people on telly anymore. But actually he was still around. He died in 1998, but he spent the last 20 years of his career pretty much touring, playing Jacob and Pitafar in the touring production of Joseph and His Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, and was still a working actor when he died in 1998 on holiday in Tunisia. I know this stuff. In his 70s. And yeah, was a busy, it's a very much a character part. Pitafar was the sort of part Ian McNeice has played in that production. So a sort of Gabor Baraka kind of part, really. There's a telesnap of a female supporting artist hiding from this rather exciting scimitar battle choreographed by Derek Ware, who I knew a little bit. And it's the big moment, and it's the major bit of filming that Darren Nesbitt and Mark Eden did before they went into the studio for episode 1. So they've done this ages ago. This is already committed to film before they start doing episode 1. So that will have been a good looking production. I noticed low cameras there, and between a whole standing Marco at one end of the studio, shot between the legs of Tigana. So there's some great shooting there, and Derek Ware knew how to do a fight scene, and being done on film, that will have looked pretty impressive. But Tigana, he's shot with an arrow in the book. In the TV version, he impales himself on a spear, so it's a kind of suicide. Not many suicides in Doctor Who. Bellboy kind of kills himself, doesn't he? Max Stale in Image of the Fendal. And that's pretty grim, isn't it? And it somehow feels a bit more appropriate than Marco killing him. I that would have seemed sort of against the sort of humanitarian element of Marco, even though he's from hundreds of years ago and standards were different. I think it just feels slightly better and slightly grimmer and oddly kind of noble in a way, in a sort of the perverse way we look at nobility, but often such things are sort of through an oddly perverse prism, that it's somehow noble to kill himself instead of being taken prisoner, and yet it kind of does. And I love this shot of the TARDIS was done on film, but the high shot, and I think it says in the script, doesn't it, that at the end we see the quartet against a space backdrop. But Marco comes good, and he says, I gave him the key, and Kubla Khan, instead of telling him off, says, no, I'd have given them the key too. And actually, it kind of feels like you could have ended Doctor Who here, which it's not out of the question. There's no cliffhanger into the next story. I'm watching episode 1 of this, the Keys of Marinus. Which has a few mistakes in it. It does seem like a different kind of program, but that's partially because all the pictures here are not, therefore, warts and all. We've got none of the warts, so there could have been all sorts of clunkiness and banging cameras and Clive Doig's tumbling columns, but it has a bit of majesty because we can imagine it, and we've got the lyricism of the script, we've got the beauty of the performance, we've got the gorgeousness of the sets, and we don't have any of the drawbacks of 60s TV production. So I'm certain that my spectacles with which I view this, even though the pictures are black and white, there's a rose-tintedness. Sword fight arranged by Derek Ware. I like those sorts of long-winded credits. Makeup supervised by Anne Farigi. I thought that was gorgeous, didn't you? I think it's a humane and thoughtful story. I think it's really intelligent. I think it elegantly seeds the educational remit into it. You get to know all of the characters. I think you feel like you've been on a journey with those people, and that they are part of your, that you adventured along with them, and that our TARDIS crew and those guest artists were part of a gang who had proper relationships that had formed over time. It's got a nice mixture of violence and horror and wit. The fact that the past is such a sort of deadly, scary place, and the environment itself brings with it its own inherent risks. I think there's so much in that. I cut myself off last week, but I think, and I am so strongly aware that absence makes the heart grow fonder, and you always fantasize about the thing that you cannot have. But I feel that Marco is the strongest story of season 1, but maybe I'd feel that if we had all of this and we couldn't see the other 7-episode epic, the Daleks, and could just hear that. But I don't know, or maybe it's because part of what Marco has, that's stronger than the Daleks has, is that its dialogue is so much better, and I think its characterization is so much better. But then it doesn't have exciting exterminating robot things, which we appreciate much more because we can see them in a way that perhaps what we can't see about Marco Polo is the least of it. Although that said, we know those sets and costumes are beautiful. But maybe the fact it's a story without space stuff means that it would perhaps seem a trifle slower. I don't know, because actually the Daleks doesn't seem any less slow because it's an older production to a modern eye. So I think you already have that compromise. It doesn't matter. I could be wrong. I'm quite happy to be wrong. I'm quite happy to be wrong, by the way, about my... I don't know, I've banged on about it a lot. By the way, to set my stall out, I am a very weirded liberal, and the comedy club I run was, I think, the first to actively seek to have diverse lineups, and not all white lineups, and not all white male lineups, and is very much at the forefront of trying to encourage acts from different backgrounds of different ethnic backgrounds and different sexualities and genders and all sorts of other things way before it was being done on television and panel shows and things like that. And a tiny little place in a corner of Manchester that isn't terribly important, but it's just to show that I'm not one of those people going, oh, blooming wokery and modern stuff. I just don't see. I don't see the keenness with which many people want to wag a finger at the past as being particularly helpful or actually particularly smart. And the sense of righteousness that comes with it, perhaps winds me up a little. But I'm aware that. But in the same way that calling the edge of destruction inside the spaceship winds me up a little bit, it's because it's new and it's not something I'm used to, and perhaps it says I'm reacting and don't like a challenge to my orthodoxy. So I'm prepared to be wrong, but hopefully I hope I'm not bad. But I don't think I am, because I try very hard not to be, and everybody I encounter I hope that their day is better for their having done so rather than worse. That's all I hope. So allow me to be wrong if I'm wrong. Right. So, and I just wanted to give a little bit of informed perspective on it as well, which I sometimes think is more important than performative righteousness. Now then, not that everybody that finds stuff problematic is doing performative righteousness either. I have to point that out. People with very good intents and absolutely just morals are uneasy about such things and want to point it out, and that is quite right too. Both of us can be right. But anyway, I'm just hearing some noise at the front door, so I'm going to pause now, and then when I get a moment, I'm going to choose my thing and see what Jeremy Bentham chooses. It'll be seconds for you. It might be a few minutes for me. Well, you see, I told you it was split seconds for you. The other members of Haydock Towers had just returned from a Sunday afternoon walk. Oh, basking in the vitamin E-rich glow of nature's benefactor, the sun, taking in that fresh air, getting some healthy exercise, interacting with other people, whilst I have been immersing myself in a nearly 60-year-old piece of television that doesn't actually exist in its original form anymore, and getting tying myself in liberal knots, trying to bring a little bit of finesse and nuance to the culture wars in the way that only a middle-aged white man can. So anyway, we've got to hear from Jeremy Bentham. But actually, the return of my other half, we had a little bit of a chat about the credit, I think, in the production guide is, in the production paperwork, is Kubla Khan's spittoon bearer, who is the small actor I was talking about, the diminutive gentleman, whose name I couldn't remember. He was called Harry Dillon. And he's not one of the Chumbleys, who are the other sort of legion of small actors that are later in the Hartnell era, also all sadly no longer with us. And like the extras from Penny Sir's Oriental casting agency, all of the small actors came from, I think she was called Peggy Lister's, and the name is something awful. It's Peggy Lister's Midgets or Peggy Lister's Performing Towards. It's something horrible. And we were talking about this interest. They all, I think Maureen O'Brien said that somebody in the production of 1984. No, that's it. It was Leo McKern, because he'd worked with Angelo Muscat, who was one of the Chumbleys, who then went on to be in The Prisoner with Patrick McGoohan, and Leo McKern was in it. Found out how much the person who ran this agency for small actors was creaming off the top of their wages. He actually, I think, reported her to Equity and had something done about it, or tried to, because they were exploited, because there's no reason it should cost any more to run an agency for somebody because they're a performer small people is the phrase we use now. I nearly said of restricted height, but I don't think that is the parlance now. Either. It pays to try and be sympathetic to the correct phraseology. Anyway, that opens up all sorts of interesting things as well. So I felt it right to invoke Harry Dillon by name as Kubla Khan's spittoon bearer, who is the first of his kind to appear in Doctor Who. But I can't find any record of him after 1967. And, that's an area where I would say we've improved upon perhaps less in a number of ways in terms of representation and the way that such people have viewed and spoken about and used within the entertainment industry than we have in other areas, which I may have touched upon in an awkward and stuttery way during the the passage of these 7 episodes. Anyway, listen up, everybody. Before we exit Cathay, let us find what Jeremy Bentham has to say about episode 7, Assassin at Peking. But first, I have to choose my 2 favourite things. My favourite thing about episode 7 and my bonus thing. So, I think my favourite thing about episode 7 is the game of backgammon, not only because it's hilarious and the line about the Doctor winning the entire produce of Burma for a year is glorious, and the fact that it shows that a lot of Doctors, slight distance and what can be seen as not quite being up with the programme is perhaps actually a ruse to mask his true cunning and intelligence. And it's a lovely bit for Hartnell. And I always like to see Hartnell sort of getting chummy with somebody and having a bit of fun with a fellow character or actor. And I like the bounce between the Khan and the Doctor, and the fact that it looks like he's going to win the TARDIS back and then he fouls it up. Because you think you see where the plot's going, and then it doesn't. And then, of course, Marco and the Travellers have to get the TARDIS back in other ways. But mostly because it's funny, but also because of how it serves the plot. And I think it surprises you then, I think, when the Doctor has to come out, and you don't even see it happen. He just comes out and goes, actually, I lost it. I think it has to be the game of backgammon. And because... Marco and Tigana and Ian had that chat about chess early on, and the way that sort of that all of the character interaction is a bit like a game of strategy and logic, and that then translates to another kind of board game later. It's got metaphor, it's got symmetry, it's got an elegance about its placing. I don't think Jeremy will choose. Am I choosing that? Yes, I've got to choose that. I haven't mentioned the design, have I? But I think Jeremy also already has, so I can't do that. He's also mentioned the script. But I feel, I would feel wrong, wouldn't I, if I didn't, invoke the designer Barry Newbury, the director Waris Hussain, the writer John Lucarotti, and the whole cast at some point. But I know that Jeremy has picked an awful lot of those because he's been quite methodical about picking the key areas. But so if not, so what can my whole thing about Marco Polo be? I mean, it looks like a glorious, epic production. I think Jeremy will probably choose something to do with some of the regulars, because they are an important part of the makeup, and obviously often overlooked in this podcast because they're not the new bit that is particular to this story. I think I have to choose, as the whole overarching thing, my bonus thing, because it touches on any elements, I have to choose character. Because the character of Marco Polo, the character of Tigana, the character of Ping Cho, the way those characters influence our regulars, who are all characterized in really interesting ways. And I think John Le Carrotti writes all the regulars very well, but he uses them within the drama well as well, and all of the characters. And then the character, comes with that, how they talk as well, and the dialogue that they get. But the way that he uses character to tell story, I think, is particularly helpful in a 7-part epic where you can't have great sweeping shots of deserts because you're in, Lime Grove Studio D or whatever. And partially because it's one of the things that hasn't really, that Jeremy hasn't in his methodical and brilliant and scrupulous way of sort of assessing the merits of this. That's one thing he hasn't honed on, although he's touched upon it in other ways. And I think character also then gives us a little bit of scope to celebrate the cast, because I haven't picked out any individual cast members, and yet I think in another story any of Mark Eden, Derren Nesbitt, Xenia Merton and Martin Miller, I think in particular, but then even Tutty Lemko and Claire Davenport with a hilarious cameo as the Empress, are all actors that in other stories would get singled out if I was struggling for an episode, and they're uniformly good. And Mark Eden is brilliant, and Marco is a great character, and very even-handedly done. Tigana is a great villain, and yes, Derren Nesbitt does that softly spoken, purring, calculating, manipulative stuff. But he's not just horrible. You kind of go, well, I sort of get where you're coming from. He's a villain with a purpose, and with his own justification. And Ping Cho is lovely. And yeah, then you've got the funny cameos as well. So character, and I think that's part that, and that comes out in the. I nearly chose the dialogue. I mean, Jeremy chose the script last week, which touches on that, but it's not just the script, but it's so rich in dialogue, and sometimes it's got all those dialogue scenes which are quite long by today's standards, but because they're told through character, because they're told with the little bits of brinkmanship that happen because of the different characters having their own different agendas and perspectives. So I'm not particularly happy with my choice, partially because I just want to go the cast, or I want to go the script. But Jeremy's chosen a lot of those big bullet points. And I think it's obvious if I say the cast. So I hope Jeremy doesn't now go the cast, or I, like Tigana, will throw myself on some non-speaking supporting artist spear. What's Jeremy gonna choose? Oh no, I recant. I love the dialogue, I love character. Do you know what I'm gonna choose, everybody? And I am gonna throw myself on the spear, because what I choose, I know for sure Jeremy isn't gonna choose. Because you know what I'm gonna choose, ladies and gentlemen, and everybody else? I am gonna choose Jeremy Bentham. I'm gonna choose my guest as the bonus thing about Marco Polo, because Jeremy Bentham wrote that book, The Early Years, so he is synonymous to me with the early years of Doctor Who, even though Marco Polo doesn't get its own chapter, because he had chapters only on the Raymond Cusick stories, because those are the ones he had photos for. But nonetheless, that book sort of has that whole of the atmosphere of the genesis and early years of Doctor Who within it. And he was our gateway to those black and white years and the people who made them. And he brought with him a sort of scholastic element to his fandom. He wasn't a fan who was sort of all about trying to trace the fictional Earth history, which I love. If you do that, I love it. It's not my sort of thing. I'm much more interested in the sort of, the culture of television making and the people who made it, and a sort of thoughtful approach to script and analysis and all of those sorts of things. That's very much up my street. But also, I think Jeremy Bentham. There were others too, and I'm not discounting them, and you'll hear for some of them during the course and lifetime of this podcast. But Jeremy was very much the kingpin, and also because I've met him subsequently and liked him, and he still has carries a certain awe. There's a certain awe about Jeremy, because he is such a sort of old-fashioned sort of gentleman type, and obviously radiates intelligence and softly spoken sort of decency and enjoyment of the show, and led to a lot of the stuff that is done today by people like Richard Bignell, who today has taught me 2 or 3 things I didn't know about something else that we were just batting back and forth on a WhatsApp about something else, who just quietly gets on with it and is a brilliant researcher. And all of that sort of historical stuff that we know about Doctor Who has very much been led by, the keenness of fans. And when the quality of those fans is of the quality of Jeremy Bentham, we all benefit. And, they leave behind a legacy of stuff that, cannot be discovered now because a lot of the people they spoke to can't be spoken to anymore. And a lot of the stuff they uncovered, if they hadn't uncovered it when they did, might not exist now. And as I say, they set the ball rolling for the work that continues today. So he's not going to choose himself because he's a humble man. But I am going to choose Jeremy Bentham and those fans who were got by the likes of Marco Polo. And that those early stories lit the torch for them. And the torch, I'd say, they handed to others, but they don't. It keeps burning in their own house. And we've come and lit our flames from their still burning torches. So yeah. For the first time ever, my bonus thing, sorry John Lucarotti's characterisation and dialogue, my bonus thing for Marco Polo is my guest, Jeremy Bentham. Who says I can't be a bit of a maverick sometimes? So what's Jeremy going to choose? Really brilliant if he goes, me actually, I'm amazing. He won't.
The high point of episode 7, Assassin at Peking. Probably not going to be too surprised, Toby, to know that I'm choosing the action scene that takes place, the big sword fight, shot on film between Tigana and Marco Polo as they duel it out in the grand finale of the story. And it's sort of a turning point for Doctor Who, this scene, because a few weeks earlier, when episode 4 was recorded, was when this issue of the Radio Times came out, the one that infamously has the Doctor, Tigana and Polo on the cover, but not the characters of Ian and Barbara and Susan, who are very much relegated inside. It's known that William Russell complained to his agent, and the agent in turn complained to the BBC, and the dictate came down from above that we should make better use of someone like William Russell in the series, actually making use of the heroic qualities that presumably he was hired for. So really, this is the last time that the ancillary characters get to play the main part in resolving the denouement of the serial, the climax, the high point, what it's all about. From then on, if we look to something like the Aztecs, Ian is far more involved in the climactic fight there, even though he doesn't actually directly kill Ixtar, any more than, funny enough, Polo kills Tigana, because Tigana runs on his sword. So it's for this reason that not only did we get a superb fight scene choreographed by Derek Ware and Douglas Camfield, which doubtlessly earned him his director's spurs, but also you got a point at which Doctor Who ever slightly changed direction and became more like the Doctor Who we were going to know in the future.
Now that is interesting. He's recorded his bonus as a separate file, so we will hear that shortly. So I chose the backgammon, he chose the fight. I suppose I didn't choose the fight. It's hard to choose a fight if you can't see it, I guess, was my reason for that. But I am very sympathetic to his choice, and I do like the observation about how it's the last time an ancillary character becomes the sort of hero, and that's interesting. Because Marco is very much the hero of Marco Polo, and that's quite right, but that's not sustainable in a story that's about Doctor Who and his companions. Although I think Ian does still get plenty of heroic stuff too. I think Barbara is probably the least well served of the regulars in Marco Polo, for which John Lucarotti atones in the Aztecs by giving her glorious amounts to do. But yeah, that's a fair choice, and it's not always nice to give Derek Ware a nod, because he was I think the very first person from Doctor Who I met, and I knew him up until he passed away. I do have an interview with him that I did somewhere over the phone about the sword fight in Marco Polo, which I'll dig out for one of these related podcasts, I'm sure. But it might be for patrons only, he said, plugging Patreon on the mainstream release, because I've been told to do that more because I don't do it enough, and it's the way of things these days. Jeremy Bentham is not going to choose himself as his bonus. What will he choose? Let's find out. Please bear in mind that my other half is sitting very patiently on a sofa, not saying a word or moving, as this that I promised would be only a couple of minutes continues. And I've just seen that Jeremy's video is 5 minutes long. but it's right because I feed it separately into the final recording, so she might be able to move. And I'm telling her that indirectly because we only communicate secondhand through podcasts because we've been together for a very long time.
And so we come then to what Toby has asked me to describe as the bonus aspect of this story. What makes it cumulatively such a masterpiece? Well, we've touched on the fact that it is an absolutely magnificent game of chess between all of the characters who appear in the story. From Tigana to Marco Polo to the Khan to Ling Tao, the knights, the pawns, all those that move around ever so magnificently during the course of this story. But it's not Doctor Who as we know it. This is the odd thing about Marco Polo, is that our characters are very much in the formative stages of what we would eventually come to know as Doctor Who and its relationship with its companions. And in a weird way, it's much closer to Sidney Newman's original concept for Doctor Who, where our four travellers are observers on the path of history, not the main contributors to it. All those roles belong to people such as Polo, to Tigana, to Pincho. They have the key roles to play, as does Ling Tao, as does the Khan. Our four characters are just not being used in the way that people will become accustomed to them in later years. The Doctor, for example, man of great learning, great intellect, but throughout this whole story, he hardly gets a chance to demonstrate that intellect. In the beginning, he suffers from altitude sickness, heat exhaustion, fatigued, he's banged up and down on the back of a horse, and displays terrible arthritis when he's meeting with the Khan. All he does, really, throughout the story, is to rage at Marco Polo and almost describe him as a mindless savage, with very little opportunity to show any of that brilliance that we would later come to identify with the Doctor. For the greater part of the first 4 episodes, he does little more than just tinker with a soldering iron in the TARDIS itself. Susan, a character who has, I suppose, the greatest role to play in the story from the point of view of separating Pincho from her loyalty to Marco Polo. And in a way, you can see there is such a warm and genuine chemistry between Carol Ann Ford and Xenia Merton. Chemistry that really gets reflected in the story. She's playing much more of a leading role and less of the screamer and person, in a way you could echoing the frustrations that Carol Ann Ford later put forward as her reasons for leaving Doctor Who. This is probably Susan's finest hour in the series. Barbara, a character who really has done more to advance Doctor Who forward in the course of the preceding couple of serials, by the fact that she's used her own intuition, her own emotional intelligence, to remind the Doctor that he can't just exist as an island on his own. He's got to trust other people. She's the first one that first susses out Tigana for what he is. She's the person who tells Marco Polo occasional truths that he may not necessarily want to hear. So in a way, she's playing a role that later on will be transferred far more into the role of the Doctor himself. Finally, Ian, the most underused character in the entire serial. Most of the things that we would later come to identify Ian Chesterton with, all the bravery, the valiant nature, his ability to handle himself both physically and mentally in situations of stress, are curiously absent here. It's Polo who slaughters the guard holding Barbara a prisoner in the cave of 500 Eyes. It's Ling Tao's men who dispatch the Kiju when he's intercepted by Ling Tao's men in part 6. And guess who has the major sword fight at the end of the story? It's Marco Polo who finally squares off against Tigana. You can possibly understand why William Russell's agent was a little bit perturbed about the fact that they got Sir Lancelot in the series but weren't using him so much. And that's as may be, because you get the feeling that maybe after this story Ian Chesterton spent a lot more time discovering the TARDIS's gymnasium and working up his six-pack ready for his next major confrontation, which would be Ixtar in John Lucarotti's second serial for Doctor Who, which is the Aztecs, of course. So again, my bonus aspect of this story is to say, make the most of the fact that you have got such a magnificent set of ancillary characters in this story, because it doesn't happen that often. You've got Pinchot, you've got Tigana, and of course all the way through, the nagging question that takes 7 episodes to answer. Marco Polo, can you save your king?
Oh, he's so good. For those of you listening to the podcast version of this, he did that in front of a chess set. And the final thing he did was topple over the king as he made his final flourish of a point. I told you Jeremy Bentham was great. And he proved it by filming a thing that, we currently don't have the pictures because it takes me a lot longer to do the video versions of these than the podcast. So I've prioritized my audio releases. Maybe when I'm in my dotage, I've kept all the video files, I'm just prioritizing time. Anyway, we don't need to worry about that. We're listening to the podcast. But Jeremy did film all of those contributions on different backdrops in his home, apposite backdrops, to reflect what he was illustrating in the way that Marco Polo uses symbolism and metaphor to make its points. So he'd really thought about, which is why he's so cherishable. His point there, very interesting about, he's sort of went to re-emphasize his point for part 7 about the ancillary characters, but he started off by talking about how this was the show in development. And I do find that fascinating, watching those early years, is that we can look at the threads that, connect them to the show now, but there's also blind alleys that they go up. There are things that they decided to do that they don't do. There are things we say they decided to do that they just thought were a good idea at the time that were never done again. Some out of policy, some out of evolution, some just because so many different people contribute to how the show is done, and some things occur and continue and some things don't, and it's really interesting watching 14 weeks into something that's now 60 years in, and the similarities and differences that combine and divide those different iterations of the show. And there are definite through lines, but there are also things that you go, oh, that's interesting, that might have been, in a sliding doors time, that might have been something they did more of or less of. I don't think I agree with Jeremy that Ian does the least, because he goes to look for Pinchot, and he has those, he's the great sort of conscience in the ear of Marco in a way, so he gets a fair bit to do. He perhaps doesn't get as much action, but I don't think he'd have killed the guard or Kuiju anyway, because he doesn't even, as I say, he doesn't kill Ixta in the Aztecs, because we don't really want our heroes dispatching people. I think it would have been nicer if Kuiju hadn't died at all, but that's just showing, life is cheap in those times, and that adds to that. The past is like an alien planet because it is, deadlier than our day-to-day life. You can be a slightly grubby merchant and not risk arbitrary death at the end of a blade of one of the good guys in a story set more recently. But so that's, I think that's I think that's part of the joy of Doctor Who. And in choosing Jeremy, I was kind of alluding to that that we have those links with those times when there was no reason Doctor Who should be what it is now then, and yet so many things that were done then make it what it is now. And I think it's lovely and fascinating seeing those things develop. So I love all of that, and those are very good points. So yes, interesting that Jeremy says and William Russell worked on his six-pack, which I know is metaphorical, but actors in those days didn't have six-packs, and it's a very I think it's very instructing for us to look at a friend of mine is watching something on BBC Four at the moment with Michael Bryant in it. It's Colin Baker's first major role on TV, and said it's lovely to see Michael Bryant has a normal body shape. He's a leading man, but isn't toned and honed and hasn't been to the gym or whatever, because actors were allowed to be like that in those days. And again, this is what interests me about what our priorities are, is that I know casting has become much more egalitarian in its outlook in terms of race and gender and colour and representation, but in terms of body shape it's miles behind. And actually the pressure put on actors from probably members of the profession who think they're really progressive in many ways, and rightly so, because they're upping representation, still very unconsciously make sure that, that even a sort of dad character is played by an actor in a slim fit shirt that fits very nicely. So it's it's instructive about what our priorities are and how they shift, and how what we think of as being liberal in some areas is not in others. And that, I think, is what I've rather candidly tried to illustrate as I've disappeared down various alleyways in terms of, and I've not necessarily particularly heard anybody scold Marco Polo massively, but obviously John Bennett in Talons and Weng Chiang comes in for a lot of opprobrium, and I think my reaction and my fixating on that is in the same way that Marco Polo is a product of its time. This podcast is a product of me perhaps probably overreacting to the most vicious voices of that kind, because my brain is a certain way. To be honest, I'm the spectrum that the end of the spectrum that I am on means that if I see something that I think is wrong, I feel the need to address it and point out that it's wrong, and blah 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 blah. And so that's me, and that's me at this time wrestling with my recent discovery of that sort of thing. So we're all bottled in a little period of time where certain things are very important and certain things are not. So the things we overlook, it's not necessarily because we're being bad to overlook them, it's because we're fixated in other areas. So I'm absolutely prepared to go, I've probably overreacted, and because most people aren't yelling at Marco Polo anyway, but also anybody that does have an objection to that practice of, I suppose we call it yellow face now, that we absolutely wouldn't do now. And a lot of people coming for that aren't doing it because they're being performatively righteous. They're people who just go, well, I find that uneasy and I don't particularly like it, and I don't want to be reminded of a time when that was done. And that equally is fair enough, and I would be wrong to criticize anybody for that. And it probably does speak also to how the Western culture is very as often seen itself as the blank template for normality or whatever, and all of that. And we do have colonial pasts to atone for. So, but as I say, I think when I stiff a bit of self-righteousness and also inaccuracy, it makes my brain go into overdrive. So I've probably overcompensated, but that means I am just caught in a particular time where you can't flick through Twitter trying to look for fun jokes about the lack of advertisements for the centenary special without somebody accusing a writer or a creator or something of an ism, when occasionally they're just doing something out of necessity or within the context of when they were doing it. But I think we're better if we're conscious of the sometimes unconscious biases that we have, and so calling them out is also equally important. So, as ever, things are complex, but mostly they're of their time, and Marco Polo is certainly that. But I hope, irrespective of that even now it's a shining example of much that is superb about Doctor Who. I mourn its loss. I would love to see it. And there would be production techniques and choices that would be perhaps uncomfortable to behold now. But I think, we come to a good place when we can see beyond that and enjoy it for what it mostly is, which is, people working more than at the top of their game on a program that has always been slightly more than a sum of its parts. And even when it's an example of a story that you wouldn't do now anyway, a pure historical, there's still so much that is recognisably Doctor Who. And yet at that stage in Doctor Who's production, there's also stuff that is slightly strange and alien to us. The characters are finding their feet. Everybody's finding their feet about what this show is. But there's enough in there that still makes it, 14 weeks in or whatever. It's more than 14 weeks, isn't it? yeah, um, to be a much missed early example of the show, for which we do not need to. We can definitely feel the loss of, and I do. Yeah, I think it's a really strong example of the show, and I'm glad we have the bits that we do, and I'm glad we have those people who were lucky enough to witness it at the time, and maybe somewhere hidden in some palace vault somewhere is perhaps Marco Polo didn't give Kubla Khan the TARDIS, but he said, but what the Doctor did before he went was he ran off a load of things from his whatever that thing is he puts on his head in the end of Wheel in Space, and he's actually got a recording of the whole adventure, Kubla Khan. You can have that. So maybe somewhere in some storehouse somewhere next to some jewels and a painting here and some trinkets from the East, there are 7 film cans of the adventures of Marco Polo and Doctor Who. But I really enjoyed that. Apart from the bits where I tied myself in knots, but as I say, that's I think that is we will have to just accept that is the time we're currently in, and those are the things that are whether they need it or not, that are occupying my thoughts, and my thoughts battle themselves out in my head and come out of my mouth, and that's what broadcasting is. So I hope it's been okay for you. It's been a long old journey with a few segues here and there. Sidney Bromley, who was a friend of William Hartnell, did I mention that? I can't remember. And still some mysteries to be had. But it's been an exciting journey to Cathay. But it's over now. Thanks to Jeremy Bentham, who I've asked to plug. And that's what we will end with. Jeremy Bentham's plug.
Well, Toby, your final request to me was to consider something I'd very much like to plug by way of a wrap-up. And I'm not very good at plugging anything that I do. It's just not something that I'm very comfortable with. But what I would like to plug is the Doctor Who figurine collection, which has been published now for a good many years and is, in my eyes at least, fulfilling a similar role to Doctor Who magazine in firing the imaginations of the Doctor Who fan community of today. But the plug I'd like to put forward and to plug in and hopefully switch on will be a plea that they might consider doing the historical characters as well as the sci-fi monsters and characters, because there are so many good villains out there from the classic era. Characters like Captain Trask, Cherub, Johnny Ringo, and of course Platoxel. The principal and foremost amongst them, I think I would make Tegana. Okay, this isn't Tegana, and I appreciate that in the fullness of time it takes longer and probably is more expensive to clear actors than it is to clear the likenesses of faceless monsters. But it would be something that I really believe would bring a little bit more of Marco Polo back into reality, because there's so much of it that we could seriously do with recovering.
Well, and isn't that appropriate? Because I have a nasty feeling as I record this. Jeremy provided this, I think, over a year ago. I had a flurry of contributors, and I've had to balance, when I release Hartnell's missing stories and other stuff. The Doctor Who figurine collection, I think, is now, like Marco Polo, missing in action and incomplete, because sadly Eagle Moss, who made them, have gone bust in very recent weeks, leaving some friends of mine without some regular work that they had, and a lot of collectors very unhappy. So that's almost a tragically appropriate note for Jeremy, who's done this so brilliantly, to to invoke the idea of humanoid figurines that now we know will. It was something that he could, in the a future he can envisage, but one that we know will now never happen, in much the same way that we're looking back at a story that we know did happen, but we cannot now envisage in full. So there's a strange and cursed symmetry about that, unless somebody else wants to pick up the mantle and make some humanoid Doctor Who figurines. And if that's the case, I expect to see a laser-printed Tigana. There's something you wouldn't have anticipated being a thing. Never mind when Marco Polo was made. Probably when Doctor Who's original run finished. But the things that people can do at home now. So there's a challenge for you out there, figurine makers. We want a Tigana and a Marco Polo, and would it kill you to do a Kubla Khan spittoon bearer while you're at it? But there we go. Thanks to Jeremy Bentham, who even unwittingly, because he wasn't to know this when he recorded that, provided a strange kind of tragic bookend to the very rich contents he has provided us over the course of the 7 episodes between Bookend 1 and Bookend 8 of his contributions to, well, no, 9, because he did the bonus thing, to his contributions to this podcast about Doctor Who and the many happy times and places, some of them sad and scary and dangerous, visited by Doctor Who and his crew, and of course, that wonderful explorer, Marco Polo. Well, thanks ever so much for listening to Happy Times and Places, which is presented by me, Toby Haydock, and my special guest, Jeremy Bentham. I'm grateful to him, of course, and to the many patrons who make these podcasts possible, and they include Ruben Herfindahl, Stephen Moffat, David Trainier, Frank Shales, Risto Matti Sarillo, Barry Platt, Adam Parker, Graham Knott, Nathan Martin, Rick Moran, Gavin McLean, Ian K. McLachlan, Joe Llewellyn, Ian Key, Chris Iam, Siobhan Galichon, Jason Gorman, Paul Dunn, Chris Dunford-Kelk, John Deere, Rob Dawson, Peter Crocker, Richard Chalk, Paul Cook, Jenny at Bluebox 99, Nigel Bromley, David Anonymous, Chris Arkle, Tim Arding, Nick Tedston, Neil Tate, Richard Straw, Christopher Meredith, Rob Leonard, Ronald Hayden, Peter Harness, Chris Vone, and Peter Burns. The music is by Dave Gates and the artwork by Dylan Patterson. If you would like to join their number, the patrons, one of the bonuses that they get is to have their names listed in the credits, is to become a patron yourself by going to patreon.com/Toby Haydock. It is a bit coming cap in hand, and it's against my natural instincts, but I'm assured it's the way these things are done. And if you are a patron, you get 3 releases a week. So if you like this sort of stuff, I think you get your money's worth. £3 per month gets you 3 releases a week. So that's 23, 6, 9, so 12 releases a month. So you do the maths. It's about 25p a release, isn't it? You also get bonus material, exclusives. There's one podcast, Far Too Much Information, that is entirely exclusive, and a monthly AMA, and direct contact, messages and things like that. And that's all at the lowest tier. There are things for the higher tiers. It goes up to I don't know what it goes. I do know. It goes up to about £200, but nobody's paying that, so that's why my cap is still resolutely glued to my hand. And if you don't want to commit to the monthly thing, which Patreon is, as I say, £3 a month, 10% off if you sign up for a year in advance, whichever tier you're at. So if you do pay the £200, you get £20 off. Aren't you lucky? But yeah, if that monthly commitment seems like too much, and I totally understand that it is. Everything's just skyrocketing price-wise, and as these are, free, you may well just prefer to keep it like that, and that's totally understandable. I'm grateful to you for listening. But you can nip to Ko-fi occasionally, as some do. if there's one you've particularly enjoyed, or you've had a particularly flush month, or whatever. And that's ko-fi.com/Toby Haydock, and there's no commitment there beyond that. You can pay in any denomination you like. So ko-fi.com/Toby Haydock, patreon.com/Toby Haydock. But what costs you nothing, and as I say, I totally understand. Thanks for listening. Just spread the word. Any words on social media that are nice, word of mouth, chatting to your friends, especially if you're outside of the UK. Most of my listeners are in the UK. I hope to have some stretch beyond that, particularly my friends in the States and Canada, where I've always enjoyed performing and mixing at conventions. And you can put 5-star reviews wherever you get your podcasts from, and perhaps a few lines as well, to let people know what they're in store for. And any extra sort of literature and writing, and any 5-star ratings gets these things algorithm-wise all finely tuned, and when it makes them look very saucy to any passing punters, and I'd like them to want to lap up my sauce. I didn't like where that went. I'm going to stop now. Thanks. I'm also on Twitter at Toby Haydock, and these podcasts have their own feed at Haydock Podcasts, and my comedy club Excess Malarkey is at Excess Malarkey on Twitter, and it's on Instagram and is on twitch.tv/Excess Malarkey the first Sunday of every month, and live in Manchester every Tuesday at 8 p.m. Sort of having to do this sneakily as my other half snoozes on the sofa, and I need to get episodes 7, which is this, and 6, which I'm going back to record the credits for. So there you go, people who follow such things. The closing credits for episode 7, because it was the latest one I edited, have actually been recorded before the closing credits for episode 6. I know, it's all lies. And I'm having to hurriedly get these out before episode 6 essentially goes out live. So look, I enjoyed that. I hope you enjoyed Marco Polo. It is one of, I think, the least well known, I think, particularly if you're from my generation or after. And gosh, there are many after now. So I hope you've enjoyed that. And I'm sorry if I tied myself in knots trying to address, I hate the phrase culture war, but, in the old days, my instinct would immediately to go, any whiff of racism needs to be attacked. And I still feel that as well. But I think people perhaps try to whiff it with too much glee where there's nothing to be done. I think there are other areas, and I think you devalue it if you're not careful. If you want to attack it everywhere, it may have existed, or you want to interpret it to exist, or you do interpret it to exist. But anyway, I worry about its currency being diminished. But I come from a good place, I hope. I just I see these arguments being had a lot, and it's sad, isn't it, that this is where we're at. Whereas, because I think a lot of people arguing with each other all actually want the same thing, but we then get finicky about the details and the whys and the wherefores and what constitutes, the genetic makeup of each of of each of the specificities of each particular argument. And I think that then creates lots of internecine wrangling, and everyone wrangles and nobody actually sorts anything out. It's a tricky world out there at the moment. As I say, maybe that's because I spent too much time scrolling on Twitter and I need to read a good book. So maybe that's what I should do. Should I take Twitter off my phone? Maybe I should. Anyway, the Where's Wally mug has made it to the end of this particular set of podcasts. So we made it to China without any getting broken. Oh, that was worth hanging around for, wasn't it? All right, ta-ta.